we don't expand our imagination,
justification for being what you
Welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm John Dickerson. If you've watched one cop show, you know about the Miranda warning given to criminals just after they're nabbed. You have the right to remain silent. For accused Times Square bomber Faisial Shahzad, there was no such warning. He was questioned and then read his rights. For some critics, though, even that was too much. One such critic is New York Congressman Peter King, who spoke to our Kaylee Hartung this morning. Kaylee, what do you have for us?
Thanks, John. This morning, Congressman Peter King sent a letter to the Attorney General. He's urging an investigation into who leaked crucial information in the attempted Times Square bombing.
Congressman, thanks so much for your time today. What is your issue with Shahzad having been read his Miranda rights?
My concern is that Shahzad and other terrorists in this country should be treated as enemy combatants, or at the very least, the national security exception should be claimed. What I mean by that is, going back to the Christmas Day bombing in Detroit, I strongly believe that he was read his Miranda rights too quickly, I think within an hour, and the intelligence we can get from these people, it goes beyond this particular terrorist. It's the intelligence he could give us, where the camp was that he was trained in. How did he find out about the camp? Who took him to it? Who were the instructors there? Were any other Americans there? Were there any plans that he became privy to that he knows about? What type of training do they get? What type of bomb-making skills do they get? When he came back to the United States, who gave him his money to buy all this equipment, to buy his plane ticket? Are there any other plots planned here in the United States? All of this is intelligence which could take hours and hours or days and days to get out of someone. And if you read a person's Miranda rights right away and he keeps quiet, you lose that opportunity. Now, I don't know all that happened in this case. And actually, it's interesting because I said at the start that they should look at it very carefully before they Mirandize him. They should, that the Attorney General should talk to all of the elements in the intelligence community, the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the CIA, the head of the DIA, all of these groups, before they give him his Miranda warnings. And people attack me saying, how can you do this to him? He's a citizen. Well, the fact is, Eric Holder did interrogate him for 9.5 hours before they gave him his Miranda warnings, which he waived. And what the Attorney General claimed was, which I agree with him, was a national security exception. If you believe this person has information that could lead to another attack, you do not have to give him his Miranda warnings. So, in effect, Eric Holder at least partially did what I was asking him to do. But we need a larger debate on this as it goes forward, because more and more we're going to find that the Islamic terrorists are going to be coming from the United States. The reason for this is we've done a very good job of stopping terrorists from coming into the United States. They were the well-trained terrorists. As a result of that, Al-Qaeda has adapted, and they are now recruiting terrorists in the United States who are here legally. They could be, they could have green cards, they could be naturalized citizens, they could be American-born. They're under the radar screen. They don't have any terrorist record. And so we have to be ready for them. And if we capture them here in the United States, I believe we should take the position that they are enemy combatants, because the battlefield is now shifted to the United States. It would be the same as if we captured a Nazi soldier in Times Square during World War II. Would we bring him down to the criminal court and read him his rights, or would we put him in a military prison? So I've discussed this with Senator Graham and others. I think what we have to do is try to find a separate vehicle of justice for people in this unique category of being enemy combatants in the United States, where you would not have to give them Miranda warnings, where you could interrogate them, where you could detain them, and then have a trial which would not be in a civilian court, and not even a military tribunal, but a separate type court for American citizens who were captured in the United States as part of an international conspiracy or an international terrorist operation.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, Miranda rights aside, he has been talking. Shahzad has been talking.
Right.
Do you think that this much information is out this early? Do you think that compromises the investigation?
No, I think all that can compromise the investigation is so much information being made public. But no, as I said, I think the Attorney General did the right thing in waiting 9.5 hours. Probably, if I were there, I would have said wait longer. But the fact is, it turns out it didn't matter. So I give the Attorney General credit, because even if they gave him his Miranda rights or his Miranda warnings, he waived it, and he continued to talk. But at any time, he can stop talking now because he's been given the Miranda warnings. No, I think it's, for whatever reason, I've heard this from people close to the investigation, he wants to talk and tell his side of the story. So the more information we can get, and he may not even realize important information he's giving us. He could say something very casually. I spoke to this person. I went to this place. I overheard this, and not realize that that is filling in a piece of the puzzle. So, no, I'm one of these people. I'm in Congress. I believe we should get more classified briefings, but there's no need at all for this to be made public. I don't want to be tipping off somebody in Waziristan or Pakistan or Connecticut or New York that we're onto them. And something that is leaked out to the papers about the interrogations, which may seem innocuous, that he went to Times Square on such and such date, or he visited this church or mosque on such and such a date, that could tip off a potential defendant.
And you have criticized that his name was leaked so early in the process.
Oh, I am very critical. In fact, I have today sent a letter to the Attorney General, Eric Holder, demanding an investigation of the leaks. What happened here is I'm never aware of sensitive information being leaked in such a high-priority criminal case before the person has been apprehended. It started on Monday afternoon. We started seeing on newspaper websites that the administration was telling reporters that this had an overseas connection, excuse me, that there was a connection to Pakistan. Then we started hearing about cell phone calls to Pakistan. And then on the evening news, we actually heard that it was a Pakistani-born individual who was a naturalized American citizen. Now, he had not been captured yet. And so this could only tip him off that they were coming after him. Because until then, we were looking for a guy who was taking off his T-shirt in Times Square, which was not him. And so he did not have reason to believe that he was the suspect. And yet, by having all this information come out, that could well have tipped him off. Also, TV stations were alerted, and their satellite trucks were moving into his neighborhood to televise the arrest. And then it was during that time, apparently, that he escaped and avoided surveillance. No one knew where he was for several hours. He went to the airport, bought his ticket, got on the plane, and the plane was about to take off when a very alert Customs and Border Protection officer spotted his name. But my point is, whoever was doing this leaking, it had to be somebody in the administration, somebody very high up who had access to the most sensitive information. That person has to really bear the responsibility for the consequences, because that could have put lives at risk and it could have compromised the entire investigation. And when I say lives at risk, they knew that he had a Tech-9, a 9mm gun. It's a heavy-duty weapon. And he had that gun with him, and he took it with him to the airport. Now, if he's been tipped off, he has that gun ready. You could have had a gun battle with FBI agents. You could have had a gun battle with police officers, or even in his house. If he sees on the television, hears on the radio that they're coming to get him, he can fortify himself in that house. And that could have put neighbors at risk, cops at risk, the television crews who were brought to observe this arrest. So it's this cannot be allowed to go on. So I am calling on the Attorney General to conduct a full investigation to find out who did it, who had access to this type of classified information.
Thanks, Kayleigh. And you can watch our full interview with Congressman King on CBSNews.com. If it weren't for the oil spill and the Times Square bomber, we'd probably be talking about the president's next Supreme Court nominee. Obama has been meeting with his potential choices, and our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, has been following all of these developments. Hello, Jan. Before we start on the Supreme Court, I want to get your reaction to Congressman King.
Oh, well, it was almost like we were listening to two different people. You know, at the end of the interview, it was striking, I thought, that he's complaining about the leaks of all of this information that we've gotten and all the sensitive information. But at the beginning of Kayleigh's interview, he's complaining that, well, we read his Miranda Rights, and so we're not going to be getting that information. So it's kind of hard to square those two things. I think the takeaway from this interview and from this issue, though, is that this has been a very effective moment for this administration as they're trying to decide whether or not they are going to read the suspect Miranda Rights, which, of course, was a huge issue after the arrest of the would-be Christmas Day bomber. This shows, I think we're going to start hearing now from this White House, that law enforcement tools work, that we need to be able to have our whole toolbox of tools to question these suspects and not just put them in military commissions and not just turn them over to the military. If you look at what the FBI has done here, they've been very effective. So I think the storyline that you're going to start seeing from the White House is that this shows we need all of those law enforcement tools and not taking them away. Right, the system can handle it. All right, so now let's move on to the Supreme Court. The president's got a list. First question is, how big is the list, and who's he been meeting with? Well, you know, they started out with this really big list of, 9 or 10, and then they were saying, well, there may be more. But he's interviewed now 4 candidates for the seat to replace Justice John Paul Stevens, the liberal leader of that Supreme Court. Obviously, this is a momentous nomination, and it's a fascinating short list of 4 that he seems to be focusing on. Now, my guidance is he's not necessarily done with the interviews, but we can look at these 4 because they are a real range of candidates. I think the front runner so far from the beginning still is Elena Kagan. Now, she's the Solicitor General. She argues the administration's position in the United States Supreme Court. The justices are very familiar with her. She's very comfortable in that building. She was the former dean of Harvard Law School. She's not considered a strong liberal. And so there are some on the left who are not happy with the idea of a Justice Kagan.
And let me interrupt quickly there. How problematic is that? You know, the left, both parties, the wings make a lot of noise, and then it doesn't turn out to be that much of a thing. How much of a problem?
This would not be a Harriet Miers.
Okay,
you're not going to see
go.
the left, as the right did when Myers was nominated, explode, because that was issues of competency and qualifications. There's no question that Kagan is brilliant. She's competent. She would be an effective justice on that Supreme Court. The only issue is whether or not she's liberal enough. Liberals see this as Barack Obama's moment. It's never going to get any better than this.
Right.
He's got 59 votes in that Senate. If Justice Ginsburg goes next year, Democrats are probably going to lose, 4 to 7 seats in the midterms. So this is as good as it's going to get. So they want him to go as strong as he possibly can, and that would be Diane Wood, who was also interviewed. She was on the short list the last time, just like Elena Kagan was, interviewed last year when he picked Sonia Sotomayor. She's considered the most liberal of the 4 he's interviewed. She would be the most controversial, the biggest fight. She's got some controversial abortion decisions, so she'd make the left happy, but she'd give the right a lot more to work with. And so that raises the big question, does this president want to expend political capital, which, as you know, John, is limited when he's got a whole legislative agenda that he wants to push through on a Supreme Court fight? And if the answer is no, and if he wants to just cave and say, I don't really want to spend any political capital.
It's an easy summer.
Then it's Merrick Garland.
Okay.
And he's also been interviewed. He's a federal appeals court judge here in D.C., considered moderate on criminal issues. I would be, and he very well could be the nominee, the left would be just out of their minds because he is much more moderate. And again, with 59 votes in the Senate, replacing John Paul Stevens, Merrick Garland would be the one you would nominate when you're in the minority in the Senate and you're replacing a conservative. So the left is saying, why do him now?
And is there any thinking, or is it just sort of parlor game thinking, that you keep Garland kind of in your back pocket for that later situation
exactly.
you talk about?
So why would you do Garland now? 59 votes in the Senate, you're replacing a liberal, you're not replacing a conservative, you're not changing the balance of the court. Why would you run the risk? Again, I hate to keep saying this, but you do have 59 votes. Why would you run the risk of making this Supreme Court more conservative than it was before Barack Obama went into the White House?
And then who's that last person on the short list?
Okay, this is our big wild card. And this, I think, is a really unknown, outside the Beltway guy named Judge Sidney Thomas from the Ninth Circuit. He's not even that well known in legal circles.
In his own family.
But he's from Montana.
Right.
And, he's rugged, and he's got a beard, and he looks, like a really everyday anti-Washingtonian guy. And he would be the purest political pick. So if we get Judge Thomas as the nominee, that means this fight is all about politics, not about how it's going to affect the court, not about a strategic pick on which justice is going to be building coalitions. He is the one who can be the tool the President Obama can use to say the Supreme Court's out of touch with everyday Americans. Republicans are out of touch with everyday Americans. We need a good populist like Sidney Thomas from Montana who can stand in the shoes of regular people like you and me and get outside the Beltway where, the real people live.
And does that then link up with the storyline they've been pushing about the Citizens United case?
Absolutely. That plays perfectly into that, this whole populist narrative that we heard, of course, in that historic State of the Union swipe that the President took at the justices, and they've kind of continued to beat that drum, pick the fight with the Supreme Court, that the court's just out of touch. So he would be the best to further that, because the other three that we've been talking about are real insiders. They're federal appeals court judges. They're part of the establishment. They're Ivy Leaguers, with the exception of Diane Wood, who, by the way, is a University of Texas grad. So she's got a little outside the Beltway cred. Big 12, it's got a lot of support there. I think Kay Bailey Hutchinson, John Cornyn. They're Longhorns fans.
That larger argument about being sort of more populist is also obviously their political argument on a whole host of other things, Wall Street and
right. So they can use these confirmation hearings as you're going into the midterm to further this narrative that they are the party of the people.
On the Sidney Thomas question, then, does anybody on the left make the argument the right does when you have an unknown pick, which is the Souter question?
No,
Will he turn into something else?
No, the left is very supportive of him, and this is why I think when you're graphing out, if you're in the White House, graphing out, who's the best you're going to get, furthers your political ambitions, and also is going to be the least fight. He's got some very liberal and very controversial opinions on social issues, a couple of which were overturned unanimously by the Supreme Court. So Republicans could, in some ways, have an easier time going against him than someone like a Diane Wood. Who's a very accomplished woman, a working mother. She's had some controversial decisions, but she's got a lot of conservative support out there in the Seventh Circuit with those conservative judges like Frank Easterbrook and Richard Posner, University of Chicago. Right. So he, in some ways, oddly enough, Mr. Montana could end up being Mr. Big controversy. Right,
no gender or race barriers. Let me ask you then, as a final question, is there anything we learn about the president from what signals they're giving us? Sometimes those signals they give us about what he's got in his head when he's making these picks are all baloney, meant to kind of deal with that political question. But what's your sense of how he's weighing this and what's in his head?
That is a great question, and this is why I think this nominee is going to be incredibly telling about President Obama's views on the role of the Supreme Court. If you look back at what he said about the court, and I've talked to him about this, he said that he thinks liberals really overstepped when they put all their stock in the Supreme Court and in the courts to change policy, and that should be done in the legislatures, right? Mm-hmm. So if he nominates someone, say like a Merrick Garland or even a Sidney Thomas, that's less a strategic pick, that's less about the court, less of a fight. That lets him say, the court's just not as important to me as an agent of change, and it's my legislative agenda that I want to get through. That's where I think the real rubber needs to hit the road. And I think that's a really significant statement from the president. We went into this, and I certainly did, thinking that he's this former constitutional law scholar. He's the one. And, last year he made a political pick with Sotomayor, and Sidney Thomas certainly would be a political pick. Garland would be someone who's not a fight. So I think this pick will be very, very telling about his views on the role of the Supreme Court.
That's great. Jan, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Can't wait to find out. Finally, a thorny question the next justice may have to address. Today is the National Day of Prayer, an annual ritual started by President Truman in 1952. Last month, a federal judge in Wisconsin declared that the law authorizing this day is unconstitutional. CBSNews.com's Brian Montopoli is here to sort all of this out for us. Brian, first let's start in Wisconsin. What happened? What was the ruling there?
Okay, well, we had a group of atheists and agnostics, and they said, look, we think this is an inappropriate law because it violates the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which says that the federal government can't establish religion. Now, the judge agreed. The judge was a little concerned, I think. The language in the ruling said this doesn't mean that prayer is bad. It just means that the federal government should not be able to mandate when and where American citizens pray.
Now, this is the kind of thing that the Republican Party, it kind of hits at two things. One is the support for religion in public life, and also anger at judges who insert themselves into that conversation. What's the reaction been from conservatives to this ruling?
Anger, mocking the judge, suggesting that we were going to ban Christmas. This is a culture war fight, and it's a culture war fight that the Obama administration absolutely does not want to have. Conservatives urged the Obama administration to appeal the ruling, and they did. The president elected to send out a proclamation this year in conjunction with the National Day of Prayer because the appeal is going through. This is a fight that is bad for the White House. They don't want to be back in this culture war fight where they're on the side of the atheists and agnostics. So they're not trying to give an inch to the Republicans here and be seen as sort of on the wrong side of this issue.
Yet, on the other hand, of course, the I don't know if it's the atheists and the agnostics, but those who have a view of trying to keep religion out of the public square often tend to vote for Democrats. And so he has problems within his own base if he makes, which is your point about why it's politically nettlesome for him.
Right, exactly. You know, if you're President Obama, you've got all this stuff on your plate. You were just talking about the Supreme Court pick. This is something you want to go away. One thing to talk about here, though, is has been something of a change on this from the Bush administration. President Bush would hold a big service on the National Day of Prayer every year, big celebration, really drawing attention to it. President Obama decided to end that practice. What that did was result in an internet rumor that said President Obama had canceled the National Day of Prayer, which he hadn't, because he preferred to pray with Muslims. Now, obviously, a lot of Americans erroneously think President Obama is Muslim, but this is the sort of fight, this is the sort of rumor that gets started around issues like this, and that's why the Obama administration doesn't want us to be talking about it.
Now, action from the Justice Department, what's the schedule on that in terms of going after and fighting back against this Wisconsin ruling?
We don't have much guidance on that. The appeal was filed last month, but you know, in terms of when we're going to get an answer, we don't know. Certainly by next year, we're going to know if the National Day of Prayer is a thing of the past. Now, there can still be private National Days of Prayer, even if this remains unconstitutional, and even atheist agnostic groups say that's fine, but in terms of a legally mandated National Day of Prayer, in terms of the President telling the American people, I encourage you to pray today, in terms of states having these sorts of things, that is what's in jeopardy.
So essentially it's just taking the national out of the presidential press release that goes out every year at this time. He could have prayers at the White House. That's not under threat here, is it?
Absolutely not. And the President's had a number of prayer breakfasts, for example, you know, over the course of his time in office. What's at threat is whether the federal government is allowed to say to citizens, today is the day that we want you to pray, which is essentially what the National Day of Prayer is. And that's what these groups are objecting to. They're saying, look, if people want to pray on their own time, that's fine, but what they can't do is have the government tell us when we need to pray when we don't necessarily want to pray.
Right. Okay. Great work, Brian. Thanks so much.
Thank you, John.
You can catch all of Brian's reports on CBSNews.com's Political Hot Sheet. Thanks all of you for watching. Join us again tomorrow right here on CBSNews.com. I'm John Dickerson. Have a great day.